Hello, everyone. I'm CJ Laguerre with Lean Startup Company, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the webcast. Today's topic is using dashboards to integrate Lean Startup into your workflow. And moderating is our very own Lean Startup Company faculty member, Adam Berk. Our guest is Beth Sordi, Group Product Manager at Adobe. And with that, I'll hand things off.
So Adam, today we are going to talk about dashboards and using those to manage tests when a team is iterating and doing innovation work. How's that sound to you?
My life has become a dashboard.
Yeah. So today we're going to assuming the folks do know a lot about how to construct tests, but we also want to talk about the management of tests, what to test, how to prioritize those tests. We're going to describe the problem that the dashboard solve for. What does it look like when a team is using a testing dashboard? Well, what's actually in a dashboard, in case folks don't know what that is. How does it look? How does it work? And how to get started using one. And then finally, we'll wrap up with some suggestion for teams so that they can get started on this.
I love it. So I'll turn it around on you in this serendipitous impromptu interview that we just put together today. What's the one question of those that you think the audience should be most interested in? If we were focusing on one as true Lean startup scholars, what do you think to get everyone excited? What do you think the most interesting, the thing that viewers will most want to know from that list?
I think how the dashboards can really help continue to move the work forward and help us from unblocking work and focusing on the right tests at the right time. What do you think?
I think the setup will be interesting to coaches and how they maintain it, but I think I'm proud of some of the work we've done with the hypotheses and what, obviously setting up the problem that the dashboards are trying to solve. But I think we finally have some measurable hypotheses on the actual differences. There's a lot of canvases, there's a lot of boards, there's a lot of really smart people out there just trying to make innovation better and more efficient. I've been using this with teams. I've seen some anecdotal aha moments with actual teams where it's like, oh, this is why this goes here. This is why this gets measured. This is why we ship this faster. I think I'm excited to share some of those hypotheses and outcomes of the dashboard.
Why don't we just start for those that might, this might be a completely new topic, and spend a little bit of time talking about what a testing dashboard is and how it's being used.
One of my prepared one-liners, I try not to walk around with too many of them, but recently, as I've been saying how a dashboard is my life, people have been saying, do you work for Trello? And of course I say, no, I work for Lean Startup Company. But the dashboard is sort of a little bit of an experiment board stand up. It's a little bit Kanban. It's a little bit, and I wasn't intentionally going to drop all these buzzwords, so we'll break it down and call me out and hold me accountable in the comments section for all these buzzwords. But yes, I think it's inspired by Kanban, right? So I am using Trello as a way, and we'll introduce the setup in a little bit, as a way to track and manage, like you said before, experiments that product teams are running. And this particular angle, this particular view focuses a little bit more on what people are testing as opposed to just sort of a hypothesis board or an experiment stand up that gets very much into the mechanics and the ingredients of an experiment or a hypothesis. To me, this gives a bit more of a three-dimensional view of all the different components that are going on in real life at a company. It's not just like putting our heads down. I think the Build, Measure, Learn slogan does a really good job of illustrating the essence of Lean Startup. But to be frank, when teams start grappling with this stuff, there's a lot of different things coming from a lot of different directions, and it's not always as clean, as a let's run an experiment, get learnings, and put those learnings into the next experiment, and 6 months later, all of our innovation problems are solved.
So let's start by defining what a testing dashboard is. So testing dashboards are what we can use to keep track of a team's progress, just like a team would keep track of their development work in Jira, Trello, or whatever, all physically through cards or whatever. But it's the same idea. And then a card represents a test that the team wants to run. Hopefully they've only got 1 or 2 tests that they're working on at a time. So you want to really limit that work in progress or test in progress. They're prioritized in order. And then there's columns for various statuses of the work to keep track of things. So there's a planned column, a blocked column, a build column, and then an in-flight column. And then finally, there's a validate column, which is after the test is run, there's a step where the team needs to go back and confirm and validate what the assumption was that originally started off the test. So that's kind of how a dashboard really looks. That's sort of the fundamentals of it. And the reason why we think it's important to talk about this is that we know that the modern company wins by applying its learnings the fastest. That's what Eric Ries presents in his latest book. And so testing dashboards are a powerful way for a team to keep track of and learn from its experiments. And I've seen this, as I think you've seen this too, is that the teams that are really making things happen are the ones that are learning the fast and able to run through the cycles of tests as quickly. Do you have anything to add to that, Adam?
So I don't want to correct my host, or I think one of the interesting things is the last column. I would characterize them, as learnings and not as validation. And we started to see this. We have that I've been learning about optimism bias recently, and we always expect that it is going to be validated,
That's true,
or even cleanly invalidated. And what I've been learning is that it's not really the case. And I've also been learning that we sort of expect all of these learnings to come cleanly at the end of an experiment. Some of the new findings I'm seeing is that a lot of learnings come from just designing the experiment. A lot of the learnings come from when they get blocked. A lot of the learnings come from when they get unblocked. A lot of the learnings come from when we just start talking to customers or understanding who our stakeholders are. So yeah, I think that, one of the problems was set up to solve for was learnings. And even that gets broken down to capturing learnings, sharing learnings, documenting learnings. But yeah, I think that last column, obviously, it's the pillar of Lean Startup, which you talked about, which is learning and learning fast. But as far as the dashboard itself, I think it was an interesting dynamic to see. A couple of years ago, I had been teaching that the learnings come when the experiment is over. That's probably a new pivot or an iteration for me. That's not always the case.
Yeah. Okay. Well, we can. That sounds good. So the last column really should be about capturing the learnings. Then it sounds like. So before we got started going over all of the dashboard details and how it works and all of that, we wanted to start with trying to really document or explain what are the jobs to be done that a dashboard can provide for. Okay, so jobs to be done. We want to know what to test next. We want to identify blockers. We need to be able to visualize and understand why we're working on what we're working on. We want to keep track of learnings. We want to repeat this more than once. We want to be able to do the system not just once or twice, but repeat this program many times because we're going to run all kinds of tests. And then there's sort of a job to be done about managing cultural things like staying organized and communicating to stakeholders, keeping our team accountable, making our team's progress visible. These are the sorts of things that we're trying to solve for. These are the jobs we're trying to get done. When you've worked with teams, what have you really noticed when they first start getting going on applying Lean Startup, and maybe they're a new team or they're an existing team? What are the common issues that you see come up for teams running tests?
So I think, we have to make that delineation. We're assuming that teams have already bought into some level of experimentation, into learning and customer centricity. But even those teams, even those teams who are already bought into it and are practicing some of it, very reluctant to a date, very reluctant to focus on singular outcomes, very reluctant to sort of put the roadmap away. I'm not advocating saying throw away roadmaps entirely. They're good. I think there's a quote, plans are useless, but planning is essential. So once a roadmap has sort of been committed to loosely, I think teams are very, very scared of putting that away for a second and be like breaking it down into piece parts and saying, I need to learn this one thing as part of a bigger picture, sort of that too small to matter mentality. So,
okay.
I think, again, we're solving for all those parts. They don't like to write stuff down. They don't necessarily want someone, telling them they were wrong about something 6 months ago. So it just obvious, just general hygiene, writing things down, committing to dates, making sure it's aligned to a bigger picture. Like we do want to give teams room to learn and to evolve and pivot and not just, create robotic outputs, but we also want to be aligned to something. Sometimes, on the innovative side of the coin, people want to just do cool stuff. On the other end, they just want to do exactly what was done 20 years ago. So again, we keep coming back to the strategic alignment. We're not here to tell you what your strategy should be, but there needs to be both sides of the coin. There needs to be a rudder. There needs to be something steering you. This is not new stuff that I'm telling, but the board really does force that alignment. And we've talked a lot about how we were almost embarrassed to do a webinar about another tool, and it's not a tool, it's how you use it. But in this case, both of us agree that the tool does sort of reinforce. You should be doing it anyway, but it makes it a little bit more visual. It makes it a little bit more malleable. It makes it a little bit more compartmentalized. Coming back to strategy.
I think what we were seeing was that, especially the last several months, you were seeing teams that were sort of getting blocked in building the tests, and then either jumping ahead and picking a new test to run because they're like, oh, I'm blocked with this one, I'm just going to pick up a new thing to go do, rather than really trying to get through and break and get the most important test unblocked first, get it going.
Yep.
I think that was one thing that we had talked about. We'd also seen where teams were not, like you said, not tracking, not writing things down, not tracking things. And I think in my experience where it's been useful is like it's really easy to forget a test you did run 6 months ago. And all of a sudden you've got your brainstorming ideas, and then everyone looks around at each other and like, oh, did we do that before? And they have like no reference. And it's really good to be able to go back to the documentation or go back to the dashboard and be like, yes, we did run this experiment and here were the findings. And then we can make an informed decision about whether we want to rerun the test or we want to do something different. But then we're not spinning our wheels and wasting time on things we've already learned, even if it was far in the past. So if we're holding true ourselves accountable to the lean startup process, it behooves us to come up with a few hypotheses ourselves about what the dashboards will do for our teams that we're coaching, right?
Yes.
So what are some of the hypotheses that you think we should state as we present this dashboard solution?
So I'll admit I'll read off a little bit of a list and then we'll talk about them together. But luckily, like we were just talking about, my initial hypotheses were about learnings. So I have that, learning cards, the cards themselves in Trello, and it depends whether you use Trello or whether we build something from scratch. Learning cards will increase by infinity, I say. So like we talked about, a lot of teams are just not document. They have reports and they have some artifacts from experiments run, but actual cards that relate to specific experiments, specific learnings broken down by experiment or by team or by strategy or by stakeholder, type of stakeholder. That comes up a lot. A different team might say, hey, this has nothing to do with the same problem or even the same project, but it's the same stakeholder. What did that team learn? That should never be used as the ultimate evidence, but it can be used to inform hypotheses. You always want to learn things firsthand. I think we talked about half-lives of learning. If something's older than 6 months, you kind of want to reinvestigate it, both from your own personal point of view, but also since, environments shift. So I have learning cards will increase by infinity. It's a little bit of a vanity metric, but that's sort of a stab that, people are just not capturing them or capturing them well or capturing them clearly or capturing them places where people can see them. So I'm going with infinity as my measure there, even though it's a little
Okay.
little bit.
Okay.
And then getting into something that's more measurable to show that things are moving along. I think learning cards, 5 new learning cards will be created per week. This is not necessarily a vanity metric if you're tallying it up, but if the learning cards are at least staying consistent, that you're still capturing learnings on a consistent basis. I have 5 per week just because of the number of, this was aggregate for a portfolio of 20 innovation teams. So yes, it's very realistic that you're not going to have one new learning. We've already acknowledged that most experiments don't ship on time.
Right.
But being said, I also said you're learning, there's not this one learning per one experiment dynamic either. So I'm starting to filter up and differentiate between, like, I don't want to call them minor learnings, but, learnings along the way and then learnings specific to that might inform a pivot, persevere decision versus, little learnings, big learnings. And and then I have a metric about total learnings will going up, but these significant learnings that people actually make new decisions on, those will be increasing. As far as running the board, I have a pretty interesting hypothesis that new teams being introduced to this board will go from, you saw earlier in the podcast, the active design column, the blocked column, and the experiments in flight. Mm-hmm. So we actually believe that 90% of teams using the board will have something go from an actively designed experiment to in-flight or blocked 90% of the time, 90% of those teams within a month of starting this board. The thing there, you may not celebrate the notion of it being blocked, because that's the same thing that I was saying. Well, they're not, but I think this active notion of it being blocked versus it just not ever getting started is, it may sound like semantics, but I think it's a big deal. But keep in mind, some of those will also be going into the in-flight category. I have a hypothesis here that using the board, 99% of experiments will be reasonably aligned to strategic objective, because that setup in column 1, where you're forced, the strategic objective itself might not be as good or as tight or as clean as you want it to be, and so we sort of advise all of our clients and all enterprises and organizations to have clear objectives. It should go without saying, but the point is that if the board's set up correctly, when you're actively designing an experiment, the board demands that you map it to one of the existing strategic priorities. So you can't just leave it blank. So by definition, an experiment just wouldn't get run if it doesn't at least have those elements, just strategic objective, the stakeholder, a date, So I'm going with 99% of experiments. The reasonably aligned part gets me out of some trouble there, but that's sort of for the product team and their innovation program to define what those strategic objectives are. Or design, the board will enforce that rule better than anything I've ever seen. A couple of metrics: X number of blockers will be identified. This can be per week, per team. I have X blocker patterns will be identified. So we talked earlier about how these patterns could be specific. What the clients I've been looking at, these patterns are permission based, resource based. They're waiting for a specific event to come. Some conference that's 6 months in the future. Identifying the patterns can inform, either how you go about unblocking them or how you just reprioritize how you work in the first place. So the patterns are just as big as the actual blockers. And then I just have coaching call. We talk about scaling these programs a lot. Coaching calls will be 4 times more efficient. And to end off, I like this metric: number of days per year without an experiment in flight will approach 0. I think
I love that.
Probably one of the most. So we started, and I kind of like how we started with learnings instead of ending with learnings. So we have some learnings metrics, some blocker metrics, and and we talk a lot about learning faster than the competition. Just, you don't want to run experiments just to run experiments, but I do think there's sort of a leading indicator there. Days without an experiment in flight, as long as it is tied to a strategic objective, and as long as it is kind of run the right way, and as long as we're experimenting on the right stuff, I still believe, and maybe I need to go out and really solidify the evidence behind that.
Yeah.
But I'm still fairly certain that decreasing the number of days per year without an experiment in flight will increase all the other metrics. And those are the metrics that people really want to see: new revenue from innovation, number of new projects, new markets, stock price.
Yeah, I think that last one's really interesting, because when you think about processes, and if you're doing any kind of lean work and trying to make things more efficient, you're always talking about, like, where's the slack in the process, and where are the gaps and periods where there's non-working activity. And that's that gets at that, right? Is that we think that by implementing these dashboards to actually pay attention to all this stuff, we'll be able to reduce the time that exists that's in that state. The slacks, the waiting time, the block time where you're waiting for review from somebody else, like whatever it is. So I think it's really an interesting hypothesis, just because it ties back to original, like, lean concepts.
And there's a balance there, right? Like we talked about it earlier. If something's blocked, on the one hand, we don't want to run something else that's waiting for the answer to the original, because that's sort of one of the foundations of lean, that we're not just going to go look for this answer if it really is dependent upon the answer, but it can unblock it faster. We can be more realistic about, does it really make sense to wait 6 months for this answer? Can we run it a different way? Can we make an argument for resources faster? Can we isolate a variable, even though normally, like, that fixed cost, maybe they would say no to, but if it's a variable cost and it can get us an answer faster, we can make the argument that 6 months waiting, it's worth, it's worth doing those things that don't scale to get an answer to this question, because we have 20 other questions that are dependent upon this one. So even if ultimately we find out that we're wrong, we can still justify getting an answer to this question. So yeah, you want to make sure that you're not just running experiments just to run experiments and to fill up time. On the other hand, if you're doing everything else right, it stands to reason that more experiments leads to more learning. It leads to you getting better at running experiments. It leads to you getting better at using what to experiment on. It leads to information that helps clarify your strategic objective. And so this is also what we talked about earlier when I talked about how you manage the board. Each time you sort of have a coach check-in, it's not just like babysitting. Did you learn this on time? Did this move from one column to the other? But it's filling in sort of the details and the clarity around the board itself. It becomes like this symphony, where all the cards are getting clearer, all the learnings are getting clearer. The stakeholders are getting more and more defined as you move along. So you're not only going from stages from, problem to solution to scale, but the clarity and the efficiency of the experiments themselves, the clarity of the learnings, the integrity of the learning so that they can be used later. Like now we're getting we're almost at the end, so I'm allowed to have some license here. Like maybe we talked about the half-life of a learning is, maybe months, but maybe it's a year, and maybe it travels further distances within the organization if it's tagged correctly, if it's mapped, back to the right thing. I don't know.
Adam, let's wrap this up. We've had a great conversation about all the reasons to implement and use dashboards and how they can create value for teams that are testing. But what are the top key takeaways for folks to take away from this session?
So I think the first thing is, like I said, if you really are already bought into some management style about learning first and documenting learning, sharing learnings, testing hypotheses, being customer centric, I have anecdotal evidence, and I'm working on some strong hard evidence that this will sort of lead to the hypotheses that we mentioned earlier. But you have to give it a chance. You have to work either with a coach or with someone else on your team, and you actually have to. It's like everything that we teach. You actually have to do it. It's not going to be perfect the first experiment you run. But again, I come back to that hypothesis we have around getting something set up once that has a smart hypothesis, it has a date, it has a strategic objective, and it has a segment. And designing that first experiment with a date of a month or less. And within a month or less, having someone hold you accountable. Did this ship? Yes. Great. Did this not ship? Why? Not getting anyone in trouble for that. But just really understanding why it didn't ship, and then making a secondary decision on, do we unblock that? Do we give it an extra week or two? Will that really make a difference? Or do we run something else, or do we test it a different way? I feel like, getting that first blocked or not blocked decision, and then of course, the blocking only is helpful if it ultimately leads to an in-flight. So you should have an experiment in flight within 6 weeks. So even if you give yourself a month to that first decision, I'm always happy to see that the decision has been made and it goes somewhere. But blocking is not, just like failure is not the goal. It's a means. It's a means to learning. Blocking is not the ideal state. I want to see cards. I want to see everyone listening getting an experiment in flight and an experiment in flight within 6 weeks of starting to use, and it should be even 2 or 3 weeks. I think other takeaways are that, learnings, not everything has to be clean, right? It's not this linear process. We'd like to think that, we agreed on a customer segment, we designed our experiment, we ran it, we have learnings, and now we build it into the next experiment. Yes, that is by and large the philosophy and how it works in theory, and it generally follows that path, but just not in straight lines or straight circles, so to speak, or straight loops. So don't be afraid to sort of, especially in the beginning, document everything. There might, you're sort of, your treasure hunters, your clue, your investigative journalists. Like, you don't know how everything is going to match up, so document everything. Don't be afraid to ask why. You don't want to like alienate other people on your team, but it's okay to have deadlines, and it's okay to ask why. And I've started seeing this with teams as well. You're not the annoying person on the team to ask why once. You don't have to call someone out that they're stupid because they can't align it to strategy, or they're a blocker, or but it's okay once to ask someone why, and it's okay once to ask what they think a reasonable deadline is. Disagree and commit is another one. If you don't agree with an experiment, it's important, if it really makes it, especially using this process, which is pretty methodical as far as like what you're testing. If there's like 3 levels for it to go from proposed to actively designed, potentially blocked. If something really gets to in flight, like, you should help run that experiment no matter what, whether you agree with it or not. If you don't agree with it, you're in good shape, because you're closer to being proven right with the results. But let the results come. Trying to kill the experiment itself. The data, the light, the truth is your friend in that case. So you should be pushing for the data in that case, not killing the experiment. Yeah. And then if someone else to listen to you, when the data speaks to the overall project, but don't try to kill the experiment. I could go on and on. Maybe maybe this is a good time to put all of my ramblings in a bullet list, and also we can get the community to chime in on tips and takeaways and things that they want to add to the list.